In the shadowed halls of Ravenshallow Plantation, South Carolina, 1851, Master Cornelius Blackwood harbored a secret so twisted that when the truth finally emerged, it would send shockwaves through the entire Low Country and beyond. His daughter Evangeline, born blind and considered unmarriageable by polite society, had become the centerpiece of his most depraved experiment. What Cornelius conceived as his legacy would instead become his destruction, unleashing horrors that would haunt 3 generations and leave an entire region forever changed. Evangeline Blackwood had been born in 1833 with eyes that saw nothing but retained an otherworldly beauty. Her blindness, rather than diminishing her appearance, seemed to enhance it, giving her an ethereal quality that unsettled everyone who encountered her. Her pale skin seemed to glow in candlelight, her auburn hair fell in perfect waves, and her sightless blue eyes held depths that suggested she perceived things others could not. But in the rigid social hierarchy of antebellum South Carolina, a blind daughter was a burden, not a blessing. Cornelius had spent 18 years watching potential suitors retreat when they learned of Evangeline's condition. No respectable family would accept a blind bride, regardless of her beauty or the Blackwood fortune. As Evangeline approached her 19th birthday in 1852, Cornelius realized she would never marry within their social circle. But rather than accept this fate, he conceived in plans so horrific it defied all natural law and human decency. Cornelius had always been obsessed with breeding, both in his livestock and his slaves. He believed superior traits could be enhanced through careful selection, that intelligence, strength, and beauty could be cultivated like prize roses in his garden. Looking at Evangeline, despite her blindness, he saw perfection that should not be wasted. If she could not marry within their race and class, then he would create a new race entirely, one that combined her ethereal beauty with the physical strength and endurance he had observed in certain of his enslaved people. The 11 men Cornelius selected for his experiment were not chosen randomly. Each possessed specific qualities he wished to preserve and enhance. There was Marcus, whose intelligence was so remarkable that Cornelius secretly used him to manage plantation finances. Samuel possessed physical strength that seemed almost supernatural, able to work 18-hour days without showing fatigue. Daniel had musical abilities that could entrance anyone who heard his voice. Jacob showed artistic talents that Cornelius both admired and resented. Each man represented some trait that Cornelius believed would, when combined with Evangeline's otherworldly beauty, produce offspring of unprecedented ability. But Cornelius faced a fundamental problem. Evangeline, despite her blindness, retained her moral sensibilities and would never willingly participate in such a scheme. He solved this dilemma through a combination of deception, manipulation, and substances that clouded judgment and memory. He told Evangeline that he had arranged secret marriages for her, that various young men from distant plantations would visit to court her properly, and that her blindness required these meetings to be conducted in complete privacy and darkness. The room Cornelius prepared for these encounters was in Ravenshallow's most isolated wing, accessible only through a hidden passage that connected to the slave quarters. He furnished it luxuriously, with silk hangings and soft furnishings that Evangeline could appreciate through touch. Most importantly, he ensured the room was completely dark, so that Evangeline's blindness would not distinguish her from any sighted woman, and her partners would remain as invisible to her as everything else in her world. The first encounter occurred in September 1852. Cornelius brought Marcus to the room after giving both Evangeline and the enslaved man substances that altered their perceptions and lowered their inhibitions. To Evangeline, drugged and disoriented, Marcus became the young plantation owner from Georgia that her father had described. To Marcus, coerced and chemically influenced, Evangeline became a willing participant rather than an unknowing victim. What Cornelius had not anticipated was the emotional connection that would develop between Evangeline and the men who visited her. Despite the artificial circumstances, despite the drugs and deception, genuine affection grew. Evangeline, starved for human connection and physical intimacy, began to look forward to these mysterious courtships. The men, despite their enslavement and the coercive nature of the situation, found themselves drawn to this ethereal woman who treated them with gentleness they had rarely experienced. By spring 1853, Evangeline was pregnant. Cornelius was ecstatic, convinced his experiment was succeeding perfectly. He moved her to a private suite where he could monitor her condition constantly, telling everyone she was suffering from a nervous condition that required complete isolation. As her pregnancy progressed, Cornelius began preparing for what he expected would be the first of many extraordinary children. The baby was born in December 1853, and from the moment of birth, it was clear this child was unlike any other. The boy, whom Evangeline named Gabriel, possessed his mother's ethereal beauty, but with features that clearly indicated mixed ancestry. More remarkably, he seemed to exhibit unusual intelligence and awareness from his earliest days. His eyes, though they appeared normal, seemed to see things that others could not, and his responses to stimuli suggested cognitive abilities far beyond typical infants. Cornelius was thrilled. Here was proof that his theories about selective breeding were correct, but he was also terrified. Gabriel's mixed heritage was obvious to anyone who looked at him, and explaining the child's existence would require admissions that could destroy the Blackwood family entirely. He decided to continue the experiment while keeping its results completely hidden. Over the next 4 years, Evangeline gave birth to 10 more children, each fathered by a different one of Cornelius's selected men. Each child possessed unique combinations of their parents' traits, creating offspring unlike anything anyone had ever seen. There was Serafina, whose musical abilities surpassed even her father Daniel's remarkable talents. Michael inherited Samuel's supernatural strength, but combined it with an intellect that seemed almost otherworldly. Ruth possessed artistic vision that allowed her to create beauty from the simplest materials. Each child was extraordinary, and each was living proof of Cornelius's crimes. But extraordinary children require extraordinary care, and Cornelius found himself struggling to manage his growing secret family. The children could not be raised with the regular slave children, as their mixed heritage and obvious intelligence would raise questions. They could not be acknowledged as legitimate Blackwood offspring for obvious reasons. Instead, they lived in a strange liminal space, hidden in Ravenshallow's unused wings, cared for by a handful of trusted slaves sworn to secrecy. As the children grew, their unusual abilities became more pronounced and more difficult to conceal. Gabriel, by age 5, could read and write better than most adults and seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of complex mathematical concepts. Serafina's singing voice could literally entrance listeners, causing them to lose track of time and reality. Michael's strength was becoming so pronounced that he could accidentally break furniture with casual movements. More disturbing was their collective behavior. The 11 children seemed to share a connection that transcended normal sibling bonds. They often moved in unison, finished each other's thoughts, and appeared to communicate without words. When one child was hurt or upset, the others would react as if they had experienced the injury themselves. It was as if Cornelius's breeding experiment had created not just unusual individuals, but a collective consciousness that defied explanation. By 1858, the situation at Ravenshallow had become untenable. The children were too old and too remarkable to remain hidden. Evangeline, now 25 and having given birth to 11 children, was beginning to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with her situation. The drugs that had kept her compliant were losing their effectiveness, and she was starting to ask questions about her mysterious suitors and her isolated children. The breaking point came when Gabriel, now 5 years old, spoke his first complete sentence in the presence of Cornelius. The child looked directly at his grandfather and said, in a voice far too mature for his age, "We know what you did to our mother. We know what you made our fathers do, and we will not forgive." Cornelius realized that his experiment had created something far beyond his control. These were not simply unusually gifted children, they were something entirely new, something that possessed knowledge and abilities that threatened the very foundations of the world he understood. Their collective intelligence was growing daily, their physical capabilities were beyond anything he had anticipated, and their emotional bond was creating a unity that made them effectively unstoppable. Desperate to regain control, Cornelius made a decision that would seal his doom. He decided to separate the children, to break their collective bond by selling them to different plantations across the South. But when he entered their quarters with slave traders to begin the separation, he found them waiting for him, all 11 arranged in a perfect circle, holding hands, their eyes closed as if in meditation. Gabriel, the eldest, opened his eyes and spoke for all of them. "You cannot separate us, grandfather. We are more than the sum of our parts. We are what you created, and we are what will destroy you." What happened next would become legend throughout the Low Country, though the true details were suppressed for generations. The 11 children, led by Gabriel, somehow coordinated their unique abilities to devastating effect. Serafina's voice, joined by her siblings harmonizing, created sounds that shattered windows throughout Ravenshallow and could be heard for miles. Michael's strength, amplified by his siblings' collective will, tore apart the plantation's main support beams. Ruth's artistic vision guided the others in arranging the destruction with terrible beauty. But their revenge was not random violence. It was calculated, symbolic, and complete. They destroyed every record of Cornelius's breeding experiments, every document that could trace their existence or their father's identities. They opened every slave cabin, broke every chain, and used their collective abilities to guide every enslaved person on the plantation to freedom. And they left Cornelius alive to witness the complete destruction of everything he had built. The children themselves disappeared that night, vanishing into the South Carolina wilderness as if they had never existed. Some say they were seen leading a massive group of freed slaves northward, using abilities that seemed to bend reality itself to avoid capture. Others claim they simply dissolved into mist and shadow, returning to whatever otherworldly realm their unique nature belonged to. Cornelius survived the destruction of Raven Shallow, but not his sanity. He spent his remaining years in a Charleston asylum, raving about demon children and supernatural revenge, creating offspring that possessed powers beyond human understanding. His accounts were dismissed as the ravings of a broken mind, and the true story of what had happened at Raven Shallow was buried beneath official reports of a slave uprising and accidental fire. Evangeline was found 3 days after the destruction, sitting calmly in the ruins of her father's study, apparently unharmed but fundamentally changed. When questioned about the events, she claimed to remember nothing beyond giving birth to children who were taken from her immediately. Medical examination revealed that her blindness had somehow been cured during the traumatic events, but her newly acquired sight seemed to show her things that others could not see. She left South Carolina immediately, disappearing into the north with resources that appeared to come from nowhere. Some claimed she was reunited with her extraordinary children, that the collective consciousness they had developed included psychic connections that transcended physical separation. Others believed she lived out her days in solitude, bearing the psychological scars of victimization so profound that memory itself had rejected the trauma. The destruction at Raven Shallow sent shockwaves throughout South Carolina's plantation society. The complete liberation of over 200 enslaved people in a single night, accomplished without any known outside assistance, terrified slaveholders throughout the region. The supernatural elements reported by witnesses were officially denied, but privately, plantation owners began taking precautions against threats they could not understand or explain. More significantly, the incident marked the beginning of what historians would later recognize as the most successful slave liberation movement in South Carolina history. Over the following months, similar mass escapes occurred throughout the Lowcountry, each involving circumstances that defied conventional explanation. Witnesses reported seeing children who possessed impossible abilities, leading groups of escaped slaves with coordination and intelligence that seemed beyond human capability. Federal investigators sent to examine the Raven Shallow incident found evidence that supported supernatural explanations, but were ordered to suppress their findings. The official report blamed the destruction on a coordinated slave revolt, but private communications between government officials revealed deep concern about implications that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality itself. The 11 children were never found, despite massive manhunts that continued for years. Their fathers, the enslaved men who had been coerced into Cornelius's experiment, had also vanished during the plantation's destruction. Some claimed they had been killed during the uprising, but no bodies were ever recovered, and witnesses reported seeing them among the groups led north by the mysterious children. Years later, during the Civil War, Union forces advancing through South Carolina encountered stories about extraordinary individuals who seemed to possess abilities that transcended normal human limitations. Soldiers reported meeting children who could communicate without speaking, who seemed to know battle outcomes before they occurred, and who could influence events in ways that suggested powers beyond conventional understanding. These accounts were dismissed as wartime mythology, but they persisted throughout Reconstruction and into the 20th century. Folklore throughout the region spoke of the Raven Shallow children, supernatural beings who continued working to liberate the oppressed and punish those who abused their power. In the 1920s, researchers investigating African American folk traditions discovered references to the Blackwood experiment throughout South Carolina's oral history. Stories passed down through generations described the blind white woman who gave birth to miracle children, the plantation owner whose evil created his own destruction, and the supernatural offspring who used impossible abilities to free their people. Modern DNA analysis of remains found at Ravenshollow's ruins has revealed genetic markers that do not match any known human populations. Archaeologists have discovered artifacts that suggest technological capabilities far beyond what should have existed in 1858. Most disturbing are the children's drawings found preserved in hidden chambers, depicting events that would not occur until decades after their creation. The true extent of Cornelius Blackwood's experiment may never be fully understood. What is certain is that his attempt to create superior beings through forced breeding produced results that transcended his wildest ambitions and most terrible fears. The 11 children born from his crimes possessed abilities that challenged every assumption about human potential and limitations. Today, Ravenshollow Plantation exists only as ruins, but the site continues to attract researchers and paranormal investigators. Visitors report unexplained phenomena, voices speaking in languages that do not exist, and sightings of figures that appear to be children, but possess an otherworldly presence that suggests they are something far more complex. The legacy of Cornelius Blackwood's experiment extends far beyond the immediate destruction it caused. It represents the ultimate expression of slavery's dehumanizing logic taken to its absolute extreme, the reduction of human beings to breeding stock in service of twisted ambitions. But it also demonstrates that even the most oppressive systems contain the seeds of their own destruction, that attempts to control and manipulate human nature inevitably produce consequences that exceed the oppressor's ability to contain. The 11 children of Ravenshollow, whether they were supernatural beings or simply extraordinarily gifted individuals shaped by traumatic circumstances, represent something that slaveholders throughout the South feared most deeply. The possibility that their victims possessed power that could not be chained, intelligence that could not be suppressed, and unity that could not be broken. Their story remains buried in official histories, dismissed as folklore and superstition, but in the oral traditions of African American communities throughout the South. The Ravenshollow children live on as symbols of resistance that transcends human limitations, proof that even the most profound evil ultimately contains the instruments of its own defeat.